Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. We are super excited to share this very first public podcast from the DFCG International Group, where it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Joanna to the podcast to talk a little bit about international CFO assignments, of which she has a fair amount of experience. So it's fantastic to have you here. Joanna, do you want to take a few minutes to introduce yourself?
Good morning, David. Good morning, everyone. It's absolute pleasure as well to talk about my experience. So briefly, I am Joanna Chavez. I'm a CFO with significant international experience. I've had a fantastic opportunity to move to London in the UK when I was at Ernst & Young in Paris at the beginning of my career. So it was an initial assignment of 2 years, and I ended up staying 16 years in the UK, subsequently moving to different companies in the retail sector. I came back to France 3 years ago, and since then, I've been involved with the DFCG and its international club.
Thank you, Joanna. So listen, why don't we get started? Because there's such a wealth of information in you in terms of what you've been through, that your career path perhaps is not what you necessarily thought of originally, but it's been a really diverse and interesting one. So maybe we'll start with a good opening question, which is, if someone is considering an international CFO assignment, what kinds of things do they need to be considering or thinking about before they accept that assignment?
Yes, clearly, because indeed it can be a choice, a decision, something you've been thinking about for quite a long time, or it can be a random opportunity. In any case, well done, because as we're going to go through, it's always very exciting to consider. I think the first thing you need to ask about yourself is are you ready for this move, and where are you with your family, your marital status, whatever it is, because an international assignment can be very cool, but sometimes it can also be a bit tricky, and you have to think that some countries, for instance, where women may not feel that comfortable because there are protective laws. So that's the first aspect. Also about qualification. Let's say you've been given that opportunity. That's fantastic because you're working for that specific company, but may be an obstacle at some point because you may not have the same credentials, and especially in a profession in finance where you have so many regulations, it can be at some point something that will not help you to take the step forward, because you're moving with this company, that's fantastic, but just imagine you love the country, you decide to stay, and you may need to want and move to another job, and you always need to look beyond the car in front. And also your visa may be attached to a specific company. So think about your credentials as well and your qualifications first. Also, depending on the distance, remember that you may feel homesick at the beginning, or you need to get home for whatever reason. So it may not be that easy, and you have to be prepared.
You raise some really interesting points. So it really isn't just about the career. It's also about how you think about basically your family, your own personal situation, your own personal preferences, and how you balance all of those things vis-a-vis this exciting opportunity in an international environment. So it's really interesting that you share that. And I think it's really helpful as a reminder for the members of DFCG and also those beyond that are listening to this podcast to keep all of those things in mind. So maybe that leads to a really interesting question then as well, is what if you found the differences to be between being an employee, for example, in a company based in France versus a company that's based outside of France, be it in the UK or potentially elsewhere?
So here, I think I'm going to point my experience in the UK because this is my only experience abroad. But definitely, I would have to say the difference is lunch. You in France, you're having lunch with your colleagues. In the UK, most of the time, you don't, but you're going to the pub at the end of the day. So this is something that you have to consider if you want to feel very integrated in the culture, but also with your colleagues, because we know that we spend most of the day with our colleagues. And if we want to develop a good atmosphere at work, a good working environment, I would say that in France, for instance, you would arrive usually at 9:30, get ready to work, let's say at 9:30. No, in the UK, it's different. It's 8:30. A meeting can start at 9. So if you start say, no, 9:30, 9 is too early for me, it won't be fantastic, and you have to get ready to have a very very busy day, but at the end of the day definitely you will enjoy some time off with your colleagues where you're going to share more of your personal life, and that's how you create some very strong links with your colleagues.
So I think my takeaway from what you're sharing is it's really important for an individual to understand the cultural and societal environment within which they go and what the expectations are and the behaviors that come with that, the norms, if you will, or the practices, or some people refer to them as rituals. So the pub experience, for example, in the UK is a long-standing ritual that's been there for many decades. So I think that's really helpful context to share with people. Thank you.
And also, I forgot to add something, something that was surprising to me when I joined the office is that it's an open space office. Even partners sit with the teams, and you have some small booth where you can isolate yourself to have a confidential call or meeting, but everyone will be all together. So I think it would help. For instance, when I was at EY in the Paris office, I would never speak to a partner, and they seemed to be so not accessible to me. Whilst at the UK office, I was having my coffee with the partner of the division.
Mm. It's true. And I found in my own international experience, the same types of practices tend to happen in Canada and tend to happen in the US as well. And even in China, it's much more of an open environment in many respects and a much more engaging environment. So it's a fascinating difference, but just being aware of these differences, to your point, is really important. So maybe that leads then to, we'll start perhaps with more of the personal aspect. How would then an individual go about integrating themselves into a new culture, which may include a new language, it may include new rituals, new ways of being? I mean, how, one, do they become familiar with them? And then two, what are some of the good practices to integrate?
So something I didn't do myself, and today I regret it. Definitely get to know the culture as much as possible ahead of you move. And there would be some books that I would recommend. There's one which is called the Culture Map from Erin Mayer, because it explains the difference in communicating across different cultures, different country, between it's a difference between high context versus low context. So low context means a clear, precise, simple communication, whereas high context implies sophisticated language with messages being read between the line. So it can be confusing because when you're used to a communicating style, you may not get everything that is being explained in the new country, and that can create some tricky situations. So get some some knowledge about it. At least you'll be prepared. Um, Also, specifically to this, to my experience, there was a book called Very British Problems. It was funny. It's a funny one, but actually, I read it after a few years after I moved to the UK, and give you great context about the so-called mannerism of our British friends, and it helps you understand their reaction in certain circumstances. As I mentioned earlier, yeah, you have to adapt. You're coming to a foreign country, you have to adapt to the culture. And also, I would say a good element is to watch TV because this is a conversation you will have with your colleagues, especially at the beginning when you don't know them that much. You will be obviously talking about some professional topics, but watching TV, discussing the program the day before can help break the ice. In terms of language, because obviously your language level may be good, but you're never prepared to so many accents. And when I moved to the UK, I was not only exposed to the British accent, I was exposed to the Scottish accent, the Irish accent, also a bit of US. And I've observed that even between all these nationalities, sometimes the communication is not that easy. So don't be shy, don't be afraid. If you don't understand something, ask. Ask because people will understand that it's not that easy for you at the beginning. Yeah. And if you think that you need some support, your English is not that good, well, go for accelerated lessons.
I think that's really important. And one thing that even I do in France, for example, is I ask people to correct me. So when I speak French, if I make a mistake or I'm struggling with a word, I've told them in advance, please help me, correct me so that I can learn. And that's a very empowering place to be as well, to your point. So why don't we build off of there and talk a little bit about, how would you then potentially lead a team in this environment? So where you yourself are trying to integrate and figure things out, and now you're being tasked with leading that finance team, be it this as a CFO or some other finance leader. What kind of advice would you give around team leadership?
So, indeed, as an international CFO, you must work with teams from different nationalities, different approaches regarding communication, decision-making process, or conflict management. I've noticed that irrespective of their seniority, some members of your team may not say that much. They may not react to sort of guideline you will tell them. It's because their instinctive discretion and their communication style is not always direct. So this is something you would have to know in advance when you go to a country. This is something I didn't do, and I think it would have definitely helped me if I'd known the British style in advance. Um, and you have to learn yourself how to adopt the best dialogue with these teams. So the dialogue and the psychology will definitely help. You need to understand how they would react. Another example, I know you spent some time in China, but I did in an email because I was working also with our Chinese office, and it was not intentional, but in a way, I discredited a Chinese person in an email in front of others. And I was told, oh, never do that. It's the major insult you could do. So all these elements, you have to, it's like you're learning new new skills, but from a human perspective.
I think that's a really, really important point, and you're absolutely right. There are some cultures where the ability to allow a person to save face is really important, and it's a big part of how trust is built in the context of the environment. So it's less about being direct and confrontational. It's much more about being supportive and helping them through. And you're right, an individual has to take the time to understand those cultural differences. And I think, as you quite rightly said, doing that in advance of going to the job location as much as possible is helpful. And then just perhaps finding a mentor to or a buddy of some kind to help you through and teach you a little bit more about the nuances that perhaps are not in a book, because of course there are localizations that are quite interesting as well. As you point out, the accents that you hear from certain countries can be very strong. They can be also quite weak in the sense of they're not heavily accented. It's more neutral. And those can often influence what you understand as well. So it's fascinating, the overseas assignment, as much as it's exciting on a career level, on a human level, I personally think it's actually more interesting as you're evoking these examples. You raise this really well. So as you then go beyond leading the team, and you mentioned this in your opening remarks when you said, look, it's also about the technical skill. So how would you look and understand, what you need to do from a technical point of view, and what kinds of things would you give as examples for an individual to be thinking about vis-a-vis their own technical knowledge or ability?
You need to be very transparent with your boss, your new environment, that you may be missing a few skills, not all of them, obviously, because you need to come with an expertise. So they would need to help you finding the best trainings you may have, you may be offered, the best seminars, how to subscribe to technical newsletters. When you join a company, you can always subscribe to a Big Four newsletter with all the technical insight. Go to register to many webinars as well. You need to make that effort to train yourself outside of. I mean, it can be between obviously the working hours, but let's be honest, it's going to be an additional investment, time investment, to train yourself and to adapt yourself to the new country's regulations. For instance, when I was in France, I've been exposed to IFRS, but not as much as I've been when I was in the UK, because in a way, UK GAAP and IFRS were fairly close. And obviously, the more you practice, I mean, think about things twice all the time. You have obviously some reflex automatism because of your knowledge in France, but in a foreign country, ask yourself twice: is it appropriate? Is it correct? And just ask. People will never reproach you to ask things to ensure that they are correct.
That's a really good point. And I think, coming back to the human skill aspect of that, it's the humility to recognize that there may be aspects that we don't know because there are localizations, to your point, that might be specific gap requirements or specific legal or regulatory requirements. So really good advice. Let me move us a little bit back to the human aspect, just as we move towards the end of the podcast. What would you suggest individuals do vis-a-vis their network? So thinking about both their home network and potentially their international network.
The network is crucial. I should have started it from day one. Eventually, I developed it a bit later. So first of all, I think by joining at work first, you would develop your network. Don't only stay with your teams. Try and be curious. Go and speak to the whole department, because you may develop a strong relationship with someone from marketing, for instance, and this is someone who can help you, or you can end up having a strong relationship in the future, even if you leave the company. Don't hesitate also to join professional networks. When I was in London, I joined Generation CFO. That's actually how I met many peers in my profession, how I get advice, because sometimes you just don't have the answer. You may be the only finance person in your team. It's a specific issue. And actually, that's how I met someone from the DFCG. And when I moved back to France, obviously my network was weaker than it was when I left 16 years before. So that was the best way for me to reintegrate my own country, because you always have to think that the next step, but also that you may move back to your home country, and it's important to have a strong network, because also remember that in some countries, especially Anglo-Saxon countries, a career in a company is not forever. You may have to move or fairly quickly. So you will jump, bounce back with this network.
And I think that advice on the network, the building, the investing in, the cultivating, the really caring about it throughout your entire career is really important. Particularly so perhaps in an international assignment, because often these things happen through relationships, more so, I would argue, in some respects than domestic promotions. So that's really, really good advice. And I agree, we should all start it as soon as we start working, and if not, even before in university. So maybe we'll end on a final note, which is you've shared a lot of insight. You've shared a lot of very practical examples, which is great. What would be the one or two nuggets, key things that you would suggest that an individual who's potentially facing this opportunity or contemplating this opportunity, what should they start with? The one or two things they start with before all others?
I think the first thing is, um, will I fit this culture? Depending as to where the assignment is. If the answer is yes, get ready, get prepared. If you want this experience to be successful with all the examples I shared. Also think that it's going to be obviously some investment from you in terms of working, especially at the beginning. But think about the long-term opportunities that it's going to give you. Obviously, the career opportunity, you're going to improve your language, you're going to improve your network, you're going to make new friends. For my personal perspective, it has given me a deeper experience I would have had if I'd stayed in France. So today I'm back in France. I've become a more attractive candidate because I'm more agile, more adaptable. Also, think about the people around you, your family. Today, I've got this dual citizenship, so it's also give me some flexibility. If I want to move back to the UK or to another country, I can. And it's also, so it means more choices for me, for my family, and for my kids.
I think that's a great way to end this podcast because it's fabulous advice. And I agree, it's really keep your eye on the long-term horizon, not just the immediate next step. So with that, Joanna, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights, your experience. Hopefully this brings a new perspective for individuals to think about, and they go into these assignments in a way where their eyes are wide open, they're doing their preparatory work, and they're more successful ultimately in the assignment. So thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it and hope to see you back soon on our podcast.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you all.